I was 28 years old when my husband's will was read aloud, and I learned exactly how disposable I had been. The lawyer's office smelled like polished wood and expensive cologne, the kind of place where bad news is delivered gently, as if softness can change the outcome. I sat straight-backed in a chair that felt too firm, my hands folded in my lap, already bracing myself for disappointment but not humiliation. Across from me, his mistress crossed her legs with practiced ease, lips curved in a smile she didn't bother to hide. When the lawyer announced that the mansion, the cars, the visible wealth would all go to her, she laughed under her breath, not loud enough to be corrected, loud enough to hurt. And then my name was read. Not alongside the mansion, not alongside the money. Just a pause, a shift in tone, a single sentence that felt like an afterthought. I was left an abandoned house on the edge of town. No explanation, no apology, no acknowledgement that I was his wife, not a stranger pulled from the street. When I opened my mouth to object, my father-in-law didn't even look at me. He said only one thing, his voice flat and cold, like a warning disguised as advice. You shouldn't go back there. That was it. No one defended me. No one explained. They watched me the way people watch a door close behind someone who no longer belongs. And I remember thinking, as I stood up and walked out with my dignity barely intact, that I would never know why. I was wrong. The drive to the house took longer than it should have. The road narrowed until it felt like a private thought no one wanted to claim. The sun had already dropped behind the trees by the time I turned onto the gravel path, my headlights cutting through dust and shadow. The house appeared slowly, not ruined the way I'd imagined, but waiting. Dark, intact. Too quiet for something that was supposed to be forgotten. I sat in the car for a full minute, keys still in my hand, listening to my own breathing. Every instinct told me to turn around, to obey the warning, but humiliation has a way of hardening curiosity into resolve. If they wanted me to stay away, I needed to know why. The front door opened without resistance. No creak, no protest. The air inside was cool and stale, but not decayed. It smelled like wood, dust, and something faintly metallic. I stepped inside and closed the door behind me, the sound echoing deeper than it should have in a house this size. The entryway was bare, but deliberate. No clutter, no abandonment. The floorboards were clean, the walls unmarked. This wasn't a place that had been left to rot. This was a place that had been emptied. As I moved further in, a strange sensation settled over me. The layout made sense in a way I couldn't explain. Turns were where I expected them to be. Light switches fell naturally under my fingers. I told myself it was coincidence, but my pulse disagreed. I had been in houses before that felt unfamiliar, even hostile. This one didn't. It felt prepared. The living area held furniture covered in sheets, positioned carefully, as if waiting for a signal to be revealed. I lifted one corner and froze. The sofa beneath wasn't old or damaged. It was clean, maintained. Someone had been here. Not years ago, recently. I backed away, suddenly aware of the sound of my own footsteps. The silence no longer felt empty. It felt attentive. In the kitchen, the cabinets were stocked, but selectively, no food, just tools, boxes labeled with dates, folders stacked neatly inside a drawer that slid open too easily, as if it had been used often. I didn't open them yet. I wasn't ready for answers. I was still trying to understand the question. A hallway led toward the back of the house, and as I walked it, my skin prickled. The walls here were narrower, the space more controlled. This part of the house felt different, intentional. I stopped in front of a door that was slightly ajar and hesitated before pushing it open. Inside was a small room. No windows, a desk, shelves, a single chair. And my name. Not carved, not written dramatically, just labeled, neat, practical, as if there had never been any doubt about who this space belonged to. I stared at it, my chest tightening, memories rearranging themselves without my permission. Moments I had dismissed. Conversations that had ended too quickly. The way my husband used to tense when I asked questions about certain trips, certain properties. How he always redirected me, gently but firmly, away from this place. He hadn't wanted me to come back here. Not because the house was worthless. Because it wasn't. I stepped fully into the room, the door closing softly behind me, and for the first time since the will had been read, I understood something with terrifying clarity. This house was never meant to be a consolation prize. It was never meant to be safe. It was never meant to be ignored. It was meant to test whether I would stay quiet. And standing there, alone in the space they never wanted me to see, I realized something else just as clearly. I wasn't leaving. I didn't sleep that night. Not really. I lay on the narrow bed I'd found in one of the back rooms, listening to the house settle, counting every unfamiliar sound until they all began to feel deliberate. When morning finally came, it arrived quietly, a pale light slipping through the gaps in the curtains like it was unsure whether it was welcome. I made coffee from a machine that shouldn't have worked but did. That detail stayed with me. An abandoned house doesn't keep its appliances in working order. Someone had cared enough to maintain this place. Someone had expected it to be used. With daylight, the fear I'd carried all night thinned into something sharper. I began to move through the house again, slower this time, not as an intruder but as an observer. The layout revealed itself in layers. Rooms weren't arranged for comfort. They were arranged for flow. Sightlines mattered. Storage mattered. Everything had a place, and nothing felt sentimental. I opened the folders I'd avoided the night before. Inside were copies, not originals, all carefully labeled. Property records, transfer notices, correspondence printed and filed, dates circled in pen. I noticed immediately that the timeline didn't match what I'd been told. Several documents related to this house predated my husband's death by months, some by more than a year. That shouldn't have been possible. The will had been presented as a final decision, something settled after his accident. But this house had been prepared long before that. The realization tightened my stomach. This wasn't something arranged in grief or guilt. This was planned. I sat at the desk and began laying papers out side by side, aligning dates, signatures, letterheads. Patterns emerged the way they always do once you stop assuming innocence. Transfers that happened quietly, filings that avoided attention, language that suggested coordination rather than coincidence. My thoughts drifted back to the lawyer's office, the way he'd cleared his throat before reading my portion of the will. How he'd avoided looking directly at me when he said the address of this house, as if eye contact would complicate his role. At the time, I'd taken it for pity. Now I understood it as compliance. He hadn't been surprised. He'd been careful. I found a copy of a preliminary deed transfer tucked into the back of one folder. It wasn't finalized, but it was signed. Not by my husband, by someone else. Someone with authority, someone who didn't need to explain themselves. That was the first lie I could prove. The story I'd been given, that this house was an afterthought, a cruel dismissal, collapsed under the weight of paper and ink. The truth was procedural, not emotional. They hadn't forgotten me. They'd contained me. I closed the folder and sat back, pressing my fingers against my temples. The house felt different now, less mysterious, more functional. It wasn't a punishment. It was a filter, designed to move me away from the center of things, away from visibility, away from leverage. The mansion had been a spectacle, public, loud, easy to envy. This place was the opposite, quiet, remote, controlled. Whoever planned this understood power better than they understood people. I checked public records on my phone, half expecting the signal to fail. It didn't. The county database loaded slowly, but the information was there, the address, the filing dates, and the confirmation I needed. One of the documents in the system matched what I held in my hands. My heart raced, not with fear, but with the thrill of alignment. I wasn't imagining this. I wasn't reaching. This was real. That thrill faded quickly, replaced by something colder. If I could see this with minimal effort, then they could see me seeing it. Verification cut both ways. I suddenly felt exposed, as if the walls had shifted just enough to remind me they weren't neutral. I moved through the house again, this time securing what I could, closing curtains, locking doors, memorizing exits. The structure made more sense now. This place wasn't meant to hide secrets forever. It was meant to hold them until someone decided to look closely enough. I thought of my father-in-law's warning. You shouldn't go back there. At the time, it had sounded like cruelty. Now it sounded like strategy. He hadn't been worried about my safety. He'd been worried about my curiosity. By the time afternoon light filled the rooms, I had made a decision. I wouldn't confront anyone yet. Confrontation would give them time to adjust, to close ranks, to rewrite the story again. Instead, I would watch, I would gather, I would let them believe the house had done its job. As I stood at the front window, looking out at the empty road leading back toward town, a strange calm settled over me. The humiliation of the will reading felt distant now, like something that had happened to another version of me. That woman had walked out believing she'd lost everything. She'd been wrong. What I'd inherited wasn't money or comfort, it was perspective. And perspective, I was beginning to understand, was far more dangerous. I turned away from the window and went back to the desk, opening the next folder with steady hands. If they thought distance would make me harmless, they had misjudged me completely. And for the first time since my husband's death, I felt something like control. The deeper I went into the house, the more it stopped feeling abandoned and started feeling selective. The front rooms were open and sparse, almost inviting, but the back corridor narrowed in a way that made me slow down without realizing it. The air felt cooler there, denser, as if the house itself was drawing a line between what was meant to be seen and what was meant to be understood. I ran my hand along the wall as I walked, noticing how clean it was. No peeling paint, no dust thick enough to suggest neglect. This wasn't decay, it was restraint. I entered a room I hadn't noticed the night before, tucked behind what looked like an ordinary storage door. Inside, the ceiling was lower, the light dimmer. Shelves lined the walls, not crammed but spaced with intention. Each item sat exactly where it belonged. Boxes were labeled, not with vague descriptions, but with precise terms and dates. Whoever organized this space had done so calmly, patiently, without urgency. That was the first thing that unsettled me. Panic leaves messes, grief leaves traces. This place showed neither. As I moved closer, a strange familiarity crept in. The height of the desk felt right. The chair slid back smoothly, stopping at the exact distance I preferred. Even the lamp cast light at an angle that didn't strain my eyes. I told myself it meant nothing, that people reused standard designs. That coincidence was common when you looked hard enough. But my pulse disagreed. I opened a drawer and found a set of notebooks, their covers worn but not damaged. I flipped through one at random and froze. The handwriting wasn't mine, but the observations were uncomfortably close. Notes about daily routines, sleep patterns, preferences I'd never spoken aloud. Nothing dramatic, nothing invasive enough to scream surveillance, just enough to suggest attention. My first instinct was denial, my second was anger. And beneath both was something colder. The awareness that no one gathers information this patiently without a reason. I backed away from the desk, scanning the room again. This wasn't a hiding place. It was a workspace, a place designed for long-term use, not emergency storage. My name came back to me then, the neat label I'd seen earlier. And with it, a pressure behind my eyes that had nothing to do with tears. I tried to ground myself by thinking logically. If this place had been prepared for me, then there had to be a beginning, a moment when I first entered someone's awareness. A sound triggered it. The faint click of a switch as I turned off the lamp echoed in a way that unlocked a memory I hadn't touched in years. I was younger then, barely settled into my marriage, visiting one of my husband's properties for the first time. I remembered standing in an unfamiliar hallway, commenting on how quiet it felt. He'd laughed softly and told me some houses were meant to listen more than they spoke. At the time, I'd thought it was a joke. Now, standing in this room, I understood it differently. The memory sharpened. I saw him clearly, the way he'd positioned himself between me and a closed door I hadn't noticed until later. How quickly he'd changed the subject when I asked what was inside. I'd assumed it was privacy or habit, or something mundane couples don't question when trust still feels effortless. It hadn't been mundane, it had been deliberate. The weight of that realization settled slowly, rearranging my understanding of our entire marriage. He hadn't kept secrets because he didn't trust me. He'd kept secrets because he didn't trust what would happen if I knew. I found another drawer beneath the desk and opened it carefully. Inside was a single folder, no label, no color coding, just paper clipped together as if it had been handled often. The first page wasn't a document at all. It was a list. My name appeared at the top. Below it, dates, locations, short notes written in a neutral tone that made my skin crawl. This wasn't observation for curiosity's sake. It was assessment. I closed the folder without reading further, my chest tight, my thoughts racing. The house seemed to close in around me, not threatening but attentive, as if it had been waiting for this moment of recognition. I wasn't trespassing. I was arriving late. Anger flared then, bright and sharp, not just at my husband but at myself, for accepting half answers, for mistaking silence for safety, for believing that exclusion always meant insignificance. I paced the room, trying to slow my breathing. The warning from my father-in-law echoed in my mind again, but this time it sounded different. You shouldn't go back there. It hadn't been concern. It had been a boundary. And boundaries exist to protect something. I realized then that this house wasn't meant to trap me. It was meant to measure me, to see whether I would question, whether I would connect dots, whether I would walk away once things became uncomfortable. Someone wanted to know how much I could see before I stopped looking. I stood in the center of the room, surrounded by evidence of a life I hadn't known I was living, and felt the last of my confusion fall away. Fear was still there, but it had changed. It no longer asked me to retreat. It asked me to prepare. I didn't know yet who else was involved or how far this reached, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty. My husband hadn't left me this house by accident. And whatever had been built here had never been meant to stay buried. The part of the house that changed everything was not hidden. It was simply quieter. I crossed into it without realizing I had crossed at all. The floor beneath my feet shifted from wide planks to narrower boards, the sound of my steps softening, as if the house itself was asking me to listen more closely. The air felt different here, cooler, more controlled. This wasn't a place designed to welcome. It was designed to contain. I paused in the doorway, a sense of intrusion creeping up my spine, not because I didn't belong, but because I did. The room ahead of me was modest in size, almost plain, yet every detail seemed deliberate. The angles were precise. The lighting fell exactly where it needed to. There was no decoration, no warmth, no attempt at comfort, just function. I took another step, then another, my pulse slowing in a way that felt unnatural. This space didn't provoke fear so much as recognition. The unsettling thought landed gently, but with weight. Someone had anticipated how I would move through this room, where I would stop, where I would look. On a narrow shelf against the wall, I noticed objects arranged with a care that bordered on intimate. Not personal items, not memorabilia, but things chosen for usefulness. A small notebook, a set of keys, a folded map with creases worn into familiar routes. I reached out and touched the edge of the map, my fingers tracing lines I recognized before my mind could catch up. That was when the sensation hit me fully. This room knew me. I backed away slowly, my breath shallow, trying to reason with myself. Preferences overlap. Patterns repeat. It meant nothing. And yet, the height of the shelf matched my reach perfectly. The chair tucked beneath the desk slid out to a distance I favored without thought. Even the angle of the lamp mirrored how I positioned one at home to avoid glare. No one builds something this precise for a stranger. A sound pulled me out of my spiral. The faint hum of electricity. I followed it to a small panel embedded in the wall, nearly invisible unless you knew to look. I pressed my palm against it, expecting nothing to happen. The light above the desk brightened instantly. I stared at it, my heart thudding. Old houses don't respond like that. Abandoned systems don't wake up on command. Whatever this place was, it wasn't dormant. It was waiting. The hum triggered a memory I hadn't thought about in years. A visit early in my marriage, to a different property, when I'd commented on how thoughtfully everything seemed arranged. My husband had smiled then, a tight smile I'd dismissed as pride, and said something that hadn't registered until now. Some spaces are built to adapt to the person inside them. Standing here, I understood the sentence differently. I sat down at the desk, my movements careful, as if sudden gestures might disturb something fragile. The surface was bare, but not dusty. A single drawer sat flush beneath it, unmarked. When I pulled it open, my chest tightened. Inside was a thin folder, no dramatic label, just my name written neatly in the corner. I stared at it for a long moment, my thoughts scattering. Seeing my name there didn't feel like discovery. It felt like confirmation. This wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't an oversight. It was intention made visible. I opened the folder with trembling fingers. The contents weren't what I expected. No photographs, no confessions, just notes. Observations written in a detached, almost clinical tone. Measurements, schedules, preferences recorded without judgment or emotion. I closed the folder again, my hands cold. The realization settled in slowly, like a heavy blanket. This house hadn't been meant to punish me. It hadn't been meant to scare me away. It had been meant to study me, to see how I responded when stripped of context and comfort, to observe whether I questioned, whether I connected patterns, whether I stayed. The warning from my father-in-law replayed in my head, clearer now than it had ever been. You shouldn't go back there. It hadn't been about danger. It had been about exposure. They hadn't wanted me to see myself reflected so clearly in something they couldn't control. I stood up, pacing the room, my fear giving way to something steadier. Anger flared, then cooled into resolve. Whatever this place was meant to do, it had miscalculated one thing. I wasn't fragile. I tested the systems again, flipping switches, opening compartments, watching how easily everything responded. The house didn't resist me. It didn't fight back. It functioned. That told me everything I needed to know. Someone had been maintaining this place. Quietly, consistently. Someone had expected this moment. I stopped in the center of the room and took a long breath. Leaving now would be safer. Ignorance would be easier. I could pretend this was all a mistake, a cruel but meaningless inheritance, and walk away. But safety had never protected me before. I looked at my name one last time, then slipped the folder back into the drawer, closing it gently. The house hummed softly around me, not menacing, not comforting, simply present. This place wasn't my inheritance. It was my introduction. And if they thought I would step back into the dark, now that I understood the shape of it, they had never really known me at all. Morning came without ceremony. No birdsong, no sense of renewal, just light creeping in through the thin curtains, revealing the house exactly as it had been the night before. Orderly, watchful, unchanged. I made coffee again, noticing how instinctively my hands moved through the space now. The machine warmed quickly, the counter was clear. The mug I'd chosen the night before sat where I expected it to be. The house wasn't unfamiliar anymore. It was efficient. That realization unsettled me more than fear ever had. I carried the mug to the desk and spread the folders out in front of me. In daylight, the documents lost none of their weight. If anything, they felt heavier, more deliberate. I stopped skimming and started organizing. Dates first, then signatures, then cross-references. I treated it the way I treated problems I couldn't afford to misunderstand. That was when the pattern sharpened. The house paperwork didn't originate after my husband's death. It didn't even cluster around it. The earliest records appeared months before his accident, filed quietly, with language that suggested anticipation rather than reaction. This place hadn't been assigned to me in mourning. It had been prepared. I circled one date in red, then another. They didn't align with the will's timeline at all. The lie was no longer abstract. It had shape. I thought again of the lawyer's voice in that paneled office, how he'd slowed when he reached my portion of the inheritance, as if careful pacing could soften a blow. I remembered the way his eyes flicked toward my father-in-law before continuing, a moment so brief I'd dismissed it at the time. It hadn't been pity, it had been confirmation. I found a document I'd missed the day before, tucked beneath a stack of correspondence. It was a draft deed transfer, unsigned but complete, outlining conditions that mirrored the final will almost exactly. The difference lay in the date. This version existed well before my husband's death. And the signature line wasn't blank. The name wasn't my husband's. I sat back slowly, my chest tight, the coffee forgotten. Whoever had signed that document had authority. Enough authority to shape outcomes without appearing on the surface of them. Enough authority to decide what I would receive before I was even meant to know I'd lost anything. This wasn't an emotional betrayal. It was a procedural one. Someone had used the law to move me where they wanted me, quietly, cleanly, without ever having to explain themselves. The house suddenly made sense. It wasn't a gift, it was a boundary. By placing me here, far from the mansion, far from the visible assets, they had isolated me without appearing cruel. The mistress received the spectacle, the house everyone could see, the life people envied. I received distance, silence, removal, containment disguised as mercy. I checked public records next, half expecting some invisible hand to stop me. Nothing did. The county database loaded slowly, the way it always did, indifferent to human drama. When the address appeared, along with filing dates that matched the documents on my desk, I felt a sharp, quiet jolt of triumph. The discrepancy was real. That triumph lasted exactly 3 seconds. If I could see this, so could they. And if I could see it from here, then my presence in this house wasn't as isolated as I'd hoped. The realization settled over me like cold water. Verification cut both ways. Proof created exposure. I moved through the house again, locking doors I'd left open, closing curtains I'd ignored. The house allowed it without resistance, as if it had been waiting for me to take control. I memorized exits, checked windows, tested the locks. Everything worked. Everything responded. This place wasn't abandoned. It was maintained. I thought of the warning again. You shouldn't go back there. It echoed differently now, stripped of pretense. They hadn't wanted me protected. They'd wanted me contained, kept somewhere quiet, where my questions wouldn't echo back into their lives. By midday, I understood one thing with painful clarity. Confrontation would be a mistake. If I went to them now, they would adjust. Close ranks, rewrite procedures. They were practiced at that. They had resources I couldn't yet see. So I did the opposite. I stayed silent. I let the house believe it had done its job. I let them believe I was exactly where they'd intended me to be, out of sight, out of mind, licking my wounds in a forgotten corner of their world. Inside, something else was happening. I wasn't grieving anymore, I was calibrating. As the afternoon light shifted across the floor, I sat at the desk and opened the next folder with steady hands. Each document added weight, but it also added clarity. This wasn't chaos. It was structure. And structures, once understood, could be challenged. I stood at the window later, watching the empty road stretch back toward town, feeling oddly calm. The woman who had walked out of that lawyer's office had believed she'd lost everything. She'd believed humiliation was the end of her story. She'd been wrong. What I'd inherited wasn't a house or a punishment. It was a position, a vantage point no one else had bothered to examine. And from here I could see far more than they realized. If distance was meant to make me harmless, they had underestimated what clarity could do. That evening I allowed myself a dangerous thought. Maybe I had time. The house was quiet in the way only rural places can be, where silence isn't empty but layered. I organized the documents again, sliding them into new folders, rearranging them with purpose. I felt efficient, capable. For the first time since the will reading, I believed patience might be enough to protect me. I didn't realize that the moment I verified the lie, the balance had shifted. The first interruption was so small I almost ignored it. A light flickered in the hallway behind me, once, then steadied. Old wiring, I told myself. Rural houses do that. I went back to my notes, forcing my breathing to slow. Then I heard a sound that didn't belong to the house. It wasn't loud, just the faint scrape of wood against wood, like a chair being nudged somewhere far away. I stood still, listening. The sound didn't repeat. Silence closed around me again, heavier this time. I checked the rooms one by one, my steps measured, my pulse ticking too fast. Everything looked the same. Doors closed, windows locked, no sign of intrusion. I told myself I was projecting fear onto ordinary noise. That was when I noticed the back door. I was certain I had locked it. I remembered the click of the bolt, the weight of the handle in my palm. Now it stood open just enough to let in a line of cool night air. This wasn't forgetfulness, this was a message. Nothing inside the house was missing. Nothing valuable had been touched. But something had been moved. A folder I had placed squarely in the center of the desk now sat angled, its corner jutting out as if to draw attention. It felt deliberate, almost polite. We were here. My mouth went dry. Fear sharpened into something precise, stripping away panic. Whoever had entered hadn't rushed. They hadn't stolen or searched wildly. They'd taken their time. They'd wanted me to notice. The power cut moments later. The lights died all at once, plunging the house into darkness so complete it felt physical. My breath caught, my hands trembling as I fumbled for my phone. No signal, no bars. Just the glow of the screen, suddenly inadequate. I moved toward the door and found it jammed, the handle resisting my pull. I tried another exit, then another. Locked, not broken, secured. The realization hit me with cold clarity. This wasn't meant to trap me forever. It was meant to hold me long enough to make a point. I forced myself to breathe slowly, counting each inhale. Panic would only give them what they wanted. I felt along the wall until my fingers found a familiar panel. When I pressed it, nothing happened. Someone had disabled it. The darkness stretched on, thick and listening. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure they could hear it. I waited for footsteps, for voices, for anything. Nothing came. Then, as abruptly as it had begun, the lights returned. The house hummed back to life, calm and orderly, as if nothing had happened. The locks released. The door opened easily under my hand. The night air rushed in, indifferent to my fear. I stood there shaking, anger rising to meet the fading panic. If they wanted me gone, they could have done worse. If they wanted me dead, this would have been the moment. They didn't. That restraint told me everything. They weren't trying to eliminate me. They were trying to intimidate me, to frighten me into leaving quietly, without involving anyone who might ask questions they couldn't control. I closed the door and locked it again, my movements steady now. I replayed the sequence in my mind, not emotionally but analytically, the timing, the precision, the limits. Power behaves differently when it's confident. It doesn't bother with subtle warnings. It acts. What I'd just experienced wasn't confidence. It was caution. I sat down at the desk, my hands still trembling, and felt something unexpected take root beneath the fear. Clarity. They didn't want attention. They didn't want law enforcement. They didn't want scrutiny. That meant whatever they were protecting was fragile enough to break under light. The warning hadn't scared me away. It had confirmed my suspicions. I spent the rest of the night securing the house properly, moving evidence to safer places, documenting what I could without using my phone. I prepared as if I were being observed, because I likely was. Every action felt deliberate, every choice weighted. When dawn came, pale and quiet, I was still awake, exhausted but clear-headed. The house no longer felt like a threat. It felt like a test. Leaving now would be easier, safer. I could walk away and pretend none of this was my problem anymore. Let them have their secrets and their quiet victories. But fear had already taken enough from me. If they were trying to scare me, it meant I was close. Close enough to matter, close enough to disrupt something they couldn't afford to lose. I stood in the center of the house listening to its steady hum and made my decision. I wasn't leaving. Whatever this place had been designed to measure, it had just learned something important about me. Pressure didn't make me retreat. It made me focus. The morning after the warning arrived without drama, and that made it worse. The house stood exactly as it had before the lights went out, before the locks held me just long enough to remind me how small I was supposed to feel. Nothing was broken, nothing disturbed. Only the faint sense that something had been interrupted mid-thought, as if I'd walked in on a conversation that stopped the moment I entered. I didn't rush this time. I moved through the rooms slowly, touching nothing, letting the quiet speak first. The message from the night before wasn't about violence, it was about timing. Someone had acted because I was close to something they didn't want found. That realization pulled my attention away from the family and back to the only person who could have anticipated all of this: my husband. I returned to the desk and reopened the folders connected to him, the ones I'd skimmed before with resentment clouding my focus. Now I read them carefully, stripping emotion away from each line. Notes I'd dismissed as evasive took on new shape. His distance wasn't random, it was measured. Every gap in information pointed in the same direction: risk management. I found a small notebook I hadn't noticed before, wedged behind a row of binders. It wasn't labeled. The pages were filled with short entries, some barely more than reminders. There was no sentiment, no apology, no confession, just planning, safeguards, delays, contingencies. One line stopped me cold. If she asks, redirect. If she insists, postpone. Not dismiss, not deny, postpone. My chest tightened as memories shifted, rearranging themselves without permission. Conversations I'd walked away from frustrated, questions he'd answered halfway, always promising we'd talk later, when things were calmer, when timing was better. I'd taken it as avoidance, as arrogance, as proof that I wasn't trusted. Now I saw it for what it was. He hadn't been hiding this place from me, he'd been hiding me from it. The thought settled heavily, bringing with it a complicated wave of anger and something dangerously close to understanding. He'd known what this house represented. He'd known who else had a stake in keeping it quiet. And somehow, impossibly, he'd believed distance would protect me. I turned another page and found what he'd been protecting. It wasn't money, not directly. It was access, records, quiet pathways through systems most people never notice until they're trapped inside them. This house wasn't a refuge. It was infrastructure, a place built to preserve information long enough for the right person to find it. And he'd believed that person would be me. The realization didn't absolve him. It didn't soften the betrayal, but it changed its shape. He hadn't chosen them over me. He'd chosen delay over confrontation, hoping time would smooth what courage had failed to face. I sat back, pressing my fingers against the edge of the desk as the house hummed around me. The mansion suddenly felt irrelevant, a public distraction designed to absorb envy and outrage. This place was where the real work happened, quiet, invisible, dangerous. The warning from the night before aligned with that truth perfectly. They hadn't acted when I arrived. They hadn't acted when I explored. They acted when I verified something concrete, something legal, something that could connect my husband's preparations to their control. The intimidation hadn't been about the house. It had been about what he left unfinished. I thought of the moment early in our marriage when he'd discouraged me from looking into one of his accounts, laughing it off as boring logistics. I remembered the tension in his shoulders, the way his hand had tightened briefly around mine before he let go. At the time, I'd thought it was condescension. It had been fear. That understanding didn't bring comfort. It brought responsibility. He had built this place to buy time, not to end the conflict. He had assumed he'd have more of it. The accident had taken that away, leaving me with fragments and questions he'd never intended me to face alone. And now someone else was scrambling to make sure I didn't finish what he'd started. I stood and walked through the house again, not searching this time, but seeing. Every system, every file, every careful omission pointed toward the same conclusion. This wasn't a personal feud. It was a structure, one that had existed long before I entered it and would continue if left unchallenged. The mistress faded completely in my mind, reduced to what she'd always been, a distraction, a visible symbol meant to draw attention away from quieter decisions made elsewhere. She hadn't been rewarded, she'd been positioned. And I had been misjudged. I returned to the desk and gathered the materials my husband had clearly meant to delay, not destroy. My anger cooled into something sharper, more focused. He hadn't trusted himself to confront them, but he had trusted me to see the truth when the time came. The house hadn't been meant to shield him. It had been meant to shield me long enough to grow into whatever this required. Outside, the light shifted, marking time I no longer had the luxury to ignore. The intimidation attempt made sense now. I wasn't being punished, I was being rushed. They wanted me gone before I could assemble the pieces into something dangerous. I closed the notebook and slipped it back into place, my hand steady. For the first time since my husband's death, I allowed myself to feel grief without confusion. Not for what we'd lost, but for what he'd tried and failed to finish. I didn't forgive him. I didn't excuse him. But I understood him. And understanding was enough to change everything. They had tried to scare me into silence. Instead, they'd confirmed what he'd always feared and what I could no longer ignore. He hadn't left me nothing. He had left me responsibility. And standing in the quiet center of the house, surrounded by truths that were never meant to surface all at once, I knew exactly what came next. Whether I wanted it or not, I was stepping into the role he'd been preparing me for. And this time, I wouldn't postpone. I stopped asking myself how I'd ended up here and started asking how it all worked. That shift was subtle, almost quiet, but it changed everything. I woke before sunrise, not from fear, but from clarity. The house felt different in the early hours, less like a challenge and more like a tool waiting to be used. I brewed coffee and sat at the desk, reviewing what I knew without emotion, as if the story belonged to someone else and I'd been asked to solve it. Grief no longer dictated my pace. It had settled into the background, heavy but stable. What remained was focus. I moved through the house again, this time with purpose. Doors I'd passed through nervously before now felt like checkpoints. Patterns emerged where I'd once seen coincidence. The wiring wasn't random. The storage wasn't arbitrary. This place had been designed to observe, to record, to preserve information quietly until it was needed. And now it was needed. I found the access points my husband had disguised as inconveniences. Secondary storage hidden behind false backs. A communication setup that relied on redundancy rather than speed. Nothing dramatic, nothing cinematic, just careful engineering meant to survive scrutiny by appearing unimportant. The house wasn't watching me anymore. It was working for me. My first move was small by design. I requested a single public record through a routine legal channel, something so ordinary it would barely register as curiosity. No accusations, no confrontation, just a question asked in the right place with the right wording. Then I waited. Silence stretched longer than I expected. Hours passed without response. I reminded myself that systems move slowly when they're pretending not to notice. Late that afternoon, the silence broke, not with an answer, but with a delay, a procedural hiccup, a request for clarification that shouldn't have been necessary. It was enough. They had noticed. I felt no surge of triumph, no rush of adrenaline, just confirmation. The system reacted because it had to, not because it wanted to. That distinction mattered. It meant my presence had weight now, even if no one acknowledged it openly. That evening, I took a drive into town, careful to keep my movements unremarkable. I didn't go anywhere connected to the family. I went to places where people worked quietly, where information passed hands without fanfare. Clerks, archivists, people who noticed discrepancies because it was their job to notice, not because they wanted to make trouble. One of them hesitated when I asked a question, just long enough to tell me I wasn't alone. She didn't say much. She didn't need to. Her silence carried more information than words ever could. Others had noticed. Others had wondered. They had simply learned to stay quiet. Silence, I was learning, protected more people than I'd realized. On my way back to the house, I checked the news out of habit. The Mistress appeared briefly in a lifestyle article, photographed in front of the mansion, smiling like someone who believed she'd won something tangible. I felt nothing, no jealousy, no anger. She was visible, and visibility was not power. She was being protected, not empowered. That understanding snapped the last thread tying my emotions to her existence. She wasn't my opponent. She was a distraction, positioned where attention could gather harmlessly while real decisions happened elsewhere. The mansion was a stage. She was a prop. The house, by contrast, was backstage. Back inside, I spread everything out again, not to overwhelm myself, but to see the shape of what I was up against. Names repeated, entities overlapped. Authority clustered in familiar places, just out of public view. This wasn't one person acting alone. It was a structure that rewarded obedience and punished curiosity with inconvenience, not violence. Yet, the intimidation from earlier still lingered at the edges of my thoughts. It hadn't been abandoned as a tactic, it had simply failed, and failures make systems adapt. I took precautions that night, not out of fear, but anticipation. Evidence was duplicated and stored separately. Notes were written by hand. Lights were kept low. I moved with the calm of someone who understood that attention was inevitable and preparation was the only defense. As midnight approached, I felt something settle into place inside me. A steadiness I hadn't felt in years. The woman who had walked out of the lawyer's office humiliated and dismissed no longer existed. She had been replaced by someone quieter, sharper, and far more dangerous to underestimate. I wasn't angry enough to be reckless. I wasn't afraid enough to retreat. I was awake. Before going to bed, I stood in the doorway of the room with my name on it and took a long breath. This place had never been meant to break me. It had been meant to see what I would do once I understood the rules. They had expected silence. Instead, I was assembling a map. And as I turned off the light and let the house settle around me, I understood one final truth with unsettling clarity. The mistress was never the prize. She was the cover. And now that I could see past it, the real game was about to begin. Once I stopped looking at people and started looking at authority, everything aligned. I spread the documents across the desk and traced decisions backward, not by who benefited, but by who had the power to approve, delay, or veto. Patterns that had felt abstract sharpened into something legible. Names repeated in margins. The same offices surfaced again and again, signatures clustered around the same dates, always just ahead of consequences, never after. The mistress appeared everywhere and nowhere at once. She benefited from outcomes she hadn't initiated. She moved into spaces already prepared for her. She spoke publicly while others remained silent. It wasn't affection that protected her, it was placement. I followed the chain upward. The lawyer executed instructions with professional detachment. The family members reacted, adjusted, performed, but none of them made the first move. None of them set policy. They complied. They enforced. They benefited within limits defined elsewhere. Control sat higher, colder, older. When the realization finally settled, it didn't arrive with shock. It arrived with relief. Confusion dissolves when the story stops pretending to be personal. This wasn't a husband choosing a mistress over a wife. It wasn't a family feud disguised as inheritance. It was a hierarchy protecting itself the way hierarchies always do, by isolating risk and redirecting blame. The warning made sense now. You shouldn't go back there. It hadn't been about the house. It had been about what the house connected. I thought of the long-standing authority within the family, the one no one questioned openly, the figure who spoke rarely, but whose preferences became policy without debate. Decisions made for stability, for continuity, for the good of everyone who mattered. I had mistaken restraint for wisdom. I had mistaken silence for neutrality. Power leaves fingerprints even when it avoids names. I mapped the structure on paper, drawing lines not between people, but between approvals. Every significant move led back to the same center. Not flashy, not cruel, just entrenched. That was the most dangerous kind. The mistress's role clarified in an instant. She wasn't rewarded. She was deployed. Her visibility absorbed outrage, envy, gossip, everything loud and public that could distract from quieter, more consequential maneuvers. She occupied the narrative space where scandal lives, allowing real control to remain untouched. They hadn't given her the mansion to honor her. They'd given it to hide behind her. My anger at her evaporated, replaced by something steadier. Detachment sharpened my focus. Emotion had been useful once, but now it was noise. This wasn't about personal betrayal anymore. It was about a system that had learned to survive by making injustice look like misfortune. As I traced the consequences outward, I saw the collateral damage I hadn't noticed before. Employees shuffled quietly when questions surfaced. Partners adjusted contracts without explanation. Accounts moved, stalled, resumed. People learned to accept inconvenience as normal because resisting it carried a cost no one wanted to pay. Silence was maintained through reward and friction, not threats. That understanding changed the stakes. Walking away now wouldn't just protect me, it would protect them. It would confirm that the structure worked exactly as intended. I felt the weight of that choice settle heavily in my chest. I couldn't unknow what I knew. The countermeasure emerged slowly, not as a grand reveal, but as a vulnerability they'd assumed no one would connect. A contradiction between public compliance and private authorization. A place where procedure relied on assumption rather than verification. It wasn't illegal by itself, it was dangerous in combination. Timing would matter. Evidence would need to be undeniable, not dramatic, legible. I reviewed my notes again, this time with that vulnerability in mind, and the structure shifted. What had looked like impenetrable authority now showed stress points, not weaknesses of character, but of process. Power collapses when its secrets become readable to people who know how to look. I prepared quietly. I didn't move pieces yet. I didn't alert anyone who might feel tempted to warn the center. I organized my findings the way the house had taught me to, clean, precise, patient. I wrote down questions rather than accusations. I framed facts so they demanded answers from the system itself. By the time evening fell, the map was complete enough to terrify me. Not because of what it revealed, but because of what it required. I wasn't preparing to confront a person. I was preparing to confront a structure that had never expected to be seen as a whole. That kind of exposure didn't end with apologies or settlements. It ended with retaliation, reform, or collapse. I accepted the cost as calmly as I could. Whatever happened next would follow me beyond this house, beyond this family, beyond the story I'd once believed I was living. I felt no thrill at the thought, only resolve. Standing at the desk, surrounded by lines and notes and connections that finally made sense, I understood the truth that frightened them most. Not exposure, not scandal, but that I could see the entire board. And once you see the board, you stop reacting to moves. You start planning them. I walked into the room they believed they controlled with nothing in my hands and no expression on my face. It was a formal space, designed to signal authority without inviting questions. Polished table, neutral walls, people seated in places they'd occupied for years, comfortable in the certainty of procedure. I took the chair offered to me at the edge, the one meant for guests who would speak briefly and then be dismissed. No one looked threatened. That was the point. They began the way they always did, with confidence wrapped in civility. The agenda moved smoothly, language stayed abstract. Decisions were framed as necessities rather than choices. When my turn came, it was introduced as a courtesy, not a moment of consequence. I let them finish. They presented their maneuver calmly, as if it were inevitable. A legal step that would clarify ownership. A financial adjustment that would simplify matters. The implication was clear without being spoken. I was expected to retreat quietly, satisfied that the process had acknowledged me. I listened, nodding once, allowing the room to read my silence as uncertainty. Then I spoke. I didn't accuse anyone. I didn't raise my voice. I asked a single question about a date, not the date they'd emphasized, but the one just beneath it, the one that mattered. The shift was subtle but unmistakable. Chairs stilled. Pens paused mid-note. Someone cleared their throat. I followed with another question, equally calm, equally precise. I referenced a document no one in the room expected me to know existed. I framed it as confusion on my part, an attempt to understand how one decision aligned with another. It didn't. The certainty in the room fractured, not loudly, but audibly. People leaned back. Eyes flicked sideways. Someone responded with procedural language meant to smooth over discomfort, to reassert rhythm. I didn't interrupt. I waited until the explanation finished, then placed the next fact gently on the table. A date, a signature, a discrepancy. The silence that followed wasn't hostile. It was calculating. They tried to dismiss it as a clerical issue. I acknowledged the possibility and moved on, layering the next piece with the same restraint. Each fact answered the last excuse. Each clarification narrowed the space they had to maneuver. What changed wasn't their tone, it was their posture. The room began protecting itself instead of them. Questions were redirected, notes were exchanged. The air thickened with the quiet awareness that something had shifted beyond personal control. That was when the third pressure entered the room, not as an accusation, but as a presence, a mention of oversight, a procedural review already underway. Nothing dramatic, nothing avoidable. The kind of attention that couldn't be dismissed without creating more of it. I didn't introduce it, I didn't need to. They recognized it instantly. Confidence gave way to calculation. Private whispers followed. Timelines were reconsidered. The move they'd prepared for me stalled, suspended under the weight of uncertainty. Not defeat, not yet, but hesitation. When the decision was deferred, it felt almost anticlimactic. No raised voices, no slammed doors, just a collective understanding that control had slipped, even if only slightly. As the meeting ended, people avoided my eyes, not out of anger, but caution. I stood, gathered nothing, and thanked them for their time. The words felt strange in my mouth, but they were true. Time had become the currency now, and I had finally been allowed some. Outside, the air felt sharper, cleaner. I didn't feel victorious. I felt anchored. The exposure hadn't been about revenge. It had been about forcing the system into daylight, where it could no longer rely on assumption alone. They hadn't lost everything, not even close. But they had lost certainty. That mattered more than any single outcome. As I walked away, I understood something with unsettling clarity. The most dangerous phase wasn't the confrontation itself. It was what followed, when power realized it could be challenged and began adapting. I had opened a door they preferred closed. Now the structure would decide whether to reform around that opening or collapse under the strain. Either way, the room no longer belonged to them alone. And as I stepped back into my life, carrying nothing visible but everything essential, I knew the real reckoning was only beginning. Because when power feels cornered, it doesn't retreat. It reveals itself. The silence that followed the confrontation felt heavier than the room itself had been. Phones didn't ring the way they usually did. Messages arrived late, if at all, and when they did, they were careful, stripped of warmth and specificity. The world hadn't exploded the way people imagine justice does. It had paused, as if waiting to see which direction it was allowed to move. I felt it everywhere. Doors that had once opened easily now required extra steps. Requests that would have been routine were delayed without explanation. Nothing I could point to. Nothing I could accuse anyone of. Just friction layered so precisely it felt intentional. Power doesn't need to attack when it can inconvenience. At first, the restraint almost made me doubt myself. I replayed the meeting in my head, wondering if I'd imagined the shift, if the cracks I'd seen were wishful thinking. But then the patterns repeated. Access revoked here. A conversation redirected there. Allies who had been neutral suddenly cautious, their voices lowered, their words chosen with surgical care. This was retaliation in its most elegant form. The cost became personal faster than I expected. Invitations stopped arriving. Familiar faces looked through me instead of at me. My name surfaced in conversations only as a complication, something to be managed rather than acknowledged. I had challenged a structure that preferred anonymity, and anonymity, I was learning, has a long memory. There were moments, quiet ones, when I questioned the price. Not whether it was fair, but whether it was survivable. Truth has a way of isolating the person who speaks it first. I felt that isolation settle around me like a second skin. Grief resurfaced then, not sharp like it had been at the beginning, but steady and aching. I mourned the simplicity I'd lost, the version of myself who believed systems were neutral and silence was harmless. That woman would never come back. And yet, retreat wasn't an option anymore. Exposure changes the shape of everything it touches. Even if I walked away now, the system would remember me as a variable it hadn't accounted for. That knowledge carried its own kind of permanence. The confirmation came quietly, the way real change often does. A record I'd been told was inaccessible suddenly wasn't. A process that had stalled began moving again, slowly, cautiously, as if testing whether it was safe to proceed. No announcements, no apologies, just motion. The system was adjusting. I didn't celebrate. I didn't even feel relief the way I'd expected. What I felt was patience, the kind that comes when you understand that outcomes don't belong to you anymore. They belong to process, and process takes time. I returned to the house one last time in the late afternoon, drawn there by something I couldn't quite name. The road was familiar now, the turns predictable. When I stepped inside, the place felt smaller than it had before, as if its purpose had been fulfilled. I walked through each room slowly, touching nothing, letting memories surface and pass. The fear I'd felt here at the beginning was gone. In its place was understanding. This house hadn't been a cage. It had been a threshold, a place meant to hold me long enough to see clearly. In the room with the desk, I sat down and opened the drawer where I'd first found my name. I didn't read the notes again. I didn't need to. Their power had already been spent. What mattered now was what I carried forward, not what remained behind. My thoughts drifted to my husband, to the choices he'd made and the ones he'd avoided. It would have been easy to paint him as a villain or a martyr. He was neither. He had been afraid, and fear had shaped his decisions more than love ever did. I didn't forgive him, not fully. Forgiveness felt too clean for something this complicated. But I accepted him, accepted that he had prepared me imperfectly, believing distance could replace courage. He had been wrong about that. But he had been right about me. I stood and closed the drawer gently, leaving the room as I'd found it. Outside, the light was beginning to fade, the edges of the world softening. I locked the door behind me and handed the keys to the person who would take responsibility for the property next. As I walked away, I felt no sense of loss. The house had given me what it was meant to give. What lay ahead was quieter and far more demanding. There would be no clean victory, no moment where everything resolved neatly. There would only be choices, made daily, about how much of myself I was willing to spend on accountability. I understood now that the fight was no longer about them. It wasn't about reclaiming what had been taken or proving what had been hidden. It was about who I chose to be after seeing the truth. That realization settled over me with unexpected calm. Power had started to lose, not because it had been defeated, but because it had been seen, and once seen, it could no longer pretend to be inevitable. Whatever came next, I was ready to meet it without illusion. Not as a reaction, but as a decision. I expected relief when it was over, some clean sense of victory that would let me close this chapter and move on. What I felt instead was quiet. Weeks passed, then months. Life didn't announce itself as changed, but it moved differently. Mornings came without dread. Evenings ended without my mind replaying conversations I wished I'd handled differently. The noise that had followed me for so long simply faded, leaving space where fear and anger used to sit. I realized then that closure rarely feels dramatic. It feels like breathing without noticing you're doing it. People often ask what happened to everyone else, as if justice is a scoreboard that needs updating. The truth is less satisfying and far more real. The family's power didn't disappear overnight. It narrowed. It slowed. Decisions that once happened quietly began to require explanation. Processes once protected by assumption started demanding documentation. That kind of change doesn't make headlines, but it leaves marks. As for the woman who lived in the mansion, her story drifted out of mine almost immediately. She remained visible for a while, smiling in public, attending events that suggested permanence. But visibility without control fades quickly. When attention moved on, so did she. I didn't feel triumph watching that happen. I felt distance. She had never been the center of my story. She had simply stood in front of it. The house stayed with me longer. Not the building itself, but what it took. I lost the ease of believing that love alone protects you. I lost the comfort of assuming systems are fair if you behave well. I lost the version of myself who avoided difficult truths because peace felt safer than conflict. Those losses mattered, I won't pretend they didn't. Growth charges interest, and it always collects. But the house gave me something in return. It gave me discernment, the ability to see structures instead of just faces, the confidence to ask questions that don't have polite answers, the steadiness to sit with discomfort long enough to understand what it's asking of you. That wasn't an inheritance. It was an awakening. I made one final decision quietly, without ceremony, about the house, about my future, about how much of this story I would carry forward with me. Letting go didn't mean forgetting. It meant choosing direction instead of orbiting the past. I didn't need revenge anymore. I didn't need applause. I didn't even need validation. What I needed was integrity, and that was something no one could take from me. Sometimes, late at night, I think about how many people live inside systems that benefit from their silence. How many are told, gently or cruelly, that they should stay away from certain doors, that going back isn't worth it, that asking questions will only hurt them. Maybe that's true for some. But for others, the moment you open the door is the moment you remember who you are. If any part of this story felt familiar to you, you're not alone. Family betrayal doesn't always look like shouting or violence. Sometimes it looks like paperwork. Sometimes it looks like a smile across a table while decisions are made without you. And sometimes it looks like a warning disguised as concern. The truth is, power often hides behind tradition, silence, and the expectation that you'll accept what you're given. You don't have to. If this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Share your experience in the comments, or tell me what moment stood out to you the most. And if you found something meaningful here, take a second to like the video and stay with the channel. There are more stories like this coming. Stories about justice, quiet strength, and the kind of revenge that doesn't destroy you in the process. Subscribe if you want to be part of that conversation. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do isn't to win loudly. It's to walk away knowing exactly what you survived.